Welcome, class. This is your biology teacher, Mr. Brown. Today we will be covering some information that on your last assessment, it showed that some of you guys are still not proficient in, and that's okay. So this is some extra instruction to help you guys, and even for those that are proficient in it, please watch this and as a quick review. So today we will be covering about Mendelian inheritance and Punnet squares, okay? For today's lesson, you will need the guided notes, the instruction with the guided notes worksheet, and you can find this in the description below. There's also two links that you will need. One is a vocabulary practice, an online game that you can play, that you should play to help you practice those vocabulary terms. And another link is for the exit ticket. So that will be at the very end of the lesson to make sure that you have learned what you're supposed to learn. So make sure that you have the worksheet printed, and let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so we are talking about Mendelian inheritance and Punnet squares. Okay, so here's an agenda for today's lesson. We will be doing a short review of the history of genetic inheritance, specifically focusing on Gregor Mendel. We will discuss necessary vocabulary terms, and we will practice how to solve Punnet square problems. So first off, who is Gregor Mendel? Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk, and he was tasked with tending to the garden. So that was his job. But he was very scientific minded, and he took very good records of the plants in his garden. And so because he was able to keep these very detailed notes, recordings, he then started to do some experiments on these pea plants, and he cross-pollinated different plants, and he noticed that some traits would show themselves over other traits. So he's the one that came up with the concept of the principle of dominance, which is one of your vocabulary terms, and we'll get into it here in a little bit. But he made these generalizations based off of these traits that he saw and these patterns that he observed in his garden. And those are known today as Mendel's laws of inheritance. So here are the vocabulary terms that you need to know in order to properly interpret and understand how to solve Punnet square problems. So the first up is a gene. A gene is just a sequence of DNA that controls for one trait. Okay, so if you remember back to your lesson, DNA makes these structures called chromosomes, and so here's our chromosomes, our homologous chromosome, and it's unraveled into a single strand of DNA. Okay. And when you take a sequence of that DNA, we call that a gene. And that gene typically controls for one trait of it for that individual. Okay, so it codes for one trait. The next term is called an allele. So alleles are just different forms of the same gene. So we have one gene, but that one gene can express itself either as a dominant or a recessive allele. So here's an example. We have one allele controlling for one trait. And remember, you get one copy from each parent. So you get one copy from your mom and one copy from your dad. So this allele codes for eye color. So from one parent, you got the allele for brown eyes, and the other one, you got the allele for blue eyes. And then we'll get into this later, but that means that you would have brown eyes, but you would carry the allele for blue eyes, because blue eyes is the recessive allele. Okay, our next vocabulary term is called a genotype. So remember, in science, we always want to make those connections. Okay, we always want to make those connections and look for those keywords. So genotype, that is an organism's genetic makeup. Remember, if you need to pause this video, if I'm going too fast or too slow, you can pause it and get these terms written down for your worksheet. Okay, so a genotype, this is an organism's genetic makeup that controls for one specific gene, and it's typically composed of two alleles, one from each parent. Okay, so we will go over these alleles and specifically what we call them, but these are the different combination of alleles, and we call those the genotype for that trait. On the other hand, genotypes code for the phenotype. So the phenotype is the physical characteristic that is actually expressed, that we can actually see or measure or observe of that organism, of the offspring. Okay, so a phenotype, remember, look for those keywords, phenotype, this is the physical trait. So remember, genotypes code for phenotypes. So there's an allele, there's the genotype for green eyes for this fly, and it coded for the phenotype, the physical trait of actually having the green eyes. Next is a dominant trait. Dominant traits are, this is the physical characteristic that is expressed if the dominant allele is present. So we're going to get into the principle of dominance here in a bit. So if the organism, if in the genotype, the dominant allele is present, that dominant allele will show through over the recessive allele. So the recessive trait is the physical characteristic that is expressed only if the dominant allele is not present. So when the dominant allele is not present and only the recessive allele is present, then that is when the recessive trait will actually be expressed in the individual organism. Up next, we have the principle of dominance. This states that if the dominant allele is present, then the dominant trait will be expressed. And last but not least, we have a Punnet square. Punnet squares are just tables or diagrams, and we use these to help us predict the possible outcomes of a genetic cross. Okay, it's a diagram used to predict the probability of a genetic cross. And our last two words are homozygous and heterozygous. So homozygous, homo means same. So homozygous is a genotype composed of two of the same alleles. So we can have homozygous dominant, or we can have homozygous recessive. So two of the same dominant or two of the same recessive alleles. Up next, we have heterozygous. Hetero is a prefix that means different. So a genotype composed of two different alleles. So they have a dominant and a recessive allele. Okay, guys, pause this video. This is where you get to practice your vocabulary terms and make sure you have a good understanding of them. Please go to the matching section when you click on this link or type the link in. Click on the matching game, and I want to see if you guys can match them up with the correct term and definition, and I want to see if who can get it in under 1 minute. So it might take you a couple of times, but I want to see who can get the terms matched correctly in less than a minute. Okay, welcome back, guys. You should have practiced your vocabulary terms. Now that you've practiced your vocabulary terms, let's learn about Punnet squares. So here are the steps to set up a Punnet square. Step one, now guys, this isn't in your notes. Feel free to write this down if you want to flip over the page or get a scrap sheet of paper. But these are some basic steps to help you set up and start to solve these Punnet square problems. So step one, you need to first determine or know the genotypes of the parents. Step two, you need to put the genotypes of the parents on the top and the left side of your Punnet square boxes. Step three, you need to then distribute those alleles from the parents to the offspring boxes. And all this is going to make more sense once you actually see some Punnet squares and we do some sample problems. And last step, step four, we need to then determine the genotype and phenotype ratios of the offspring. Now, guys, you need to take these notes, and you also need to fill in your Punnet square on your worksheet. So this is what a Punnet square looks like. You guys, it doesn't matter if the father goes up here or the mother's goes here. They can go either one. So parent one and parent two. So the parents' genotypes will go on the side, and on each line, we will place one allele. And the whole reason we do this is because we don't know which allele will get passed on. So it's literally the flip of a coin. So the father may pass on this allele, or they may pass on this allele. We don't know. So we put the father's genotypes separating the alleles here, and then the mother's we put over here, and we separate her alleles. And then we have the 4 possible offspring genotypes. Some things to know and not know about Punnet squares, what they are and what they are not. They predict the possible genetic outcome of only one trait for only one offspring. So there's not 4 offspring, there's 1 offspring, and these are 4 possible outcomes, 4 possible genotypes. And we use the principle of dominance. Okay, so now we're going to solve problems number 1 and 2 together as a class. So question number 1, brown eyes is dominant over blue eyes. So the mother's genotype is heterozygous, big B, little b. The dad's is homozygous dominant. So once again, it doesn't matter which parent we put where, but we do need to put the parents' genotypes on the top and the left side of our Punnet square, and we need to separate our alleles. So here we have the dad is big B, and then the mom is big B, little b. Now so that was step 1, was knowing the parents. Step 2 is putting them on the square. Step 3, we need to distribute the alleles. So big B, dominant, recessive, dominant, recessive. So now we have our offspring filled in. Now step 4 is where we need to calculate our ratios and percentages. So then you just look in the offspring boxes. How many were homozygous dominant? So we have 2 that were homozygous dominant. So we put 2 out of 4, or 50%. Okay, so these are the genotypes of the offspring. Up next, we have heterozygous. How many are heterozygous? So we have 1, 2. So we have 2 out of 4. So that is the other 50%. Now this will always add up to 100%. And you can check that by looking, are there any that are homozygous recessive? There are not any offspring, so you can just say 0 out of 4, 0%. Okay, so now we've done genotype. Now we need to do our phenotype. So the phenotypes, how many will have brown eyes? Well, how many have the dominant allele for brown eyes? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we have 4 out of 4, and that is equal to 100%. So these 2 parents have a 100% chance, and we know that to have blue eyes, they would not have the dominant allele. So there's none of these that do not have at least 1 dominant allele. So that's 0 out of 4, which is 0% chance. So that means that these 2 parents have a 100% chance of having an offspring with brown eyes. Up next, we're going to do 1 more sample problem, and then you're going to do 2 on your own. So question number 2, curly hair is recessive, straight hair is dominant. A woman with curly hair marries a man who is homozygous dominant. For straight hair, predict the outcomes for their children. So step 1, we need to find the genotypes of the parents. Sometimes it helps if you write the alleles in the sentence. So recessive is a little lowercase letter, and dominant is an uppercase letter. So how do we get a woman with curly hair? Well, curly is recessive, so that means she does not have the dominant allele at all. So otherwise she would have straight hair. So we have homozygous recessive, and then we have the father who has straight hair, and he is homozygous dominant. So he has 2 dominant alleles, or 2 capital letters. So then step 2, we put the parents' genotypes on the outside of our boxes. Step 3, distribute our alleles. So homozygous, heterozygous, they are all heterozygous. So then we've distributed our alleles. How many were homozygous dominant of the offspring? We're just looking at the offspring. Well, 0 out of 4, or 0%. How many were hetero? So they have 1 of each. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4 out of 4. And last but not least, homozygous recessive, 0 out of 4, which is 0%. So that means that these 2 parents, both homozygous, 1 homozygous recessive, 1 homozygous dominant, have a 100% chance of having a heterozygous offspring. Last but not least, we need to do their phenotypes. And how do we know if they're going to have straight or curly hair? Well, remember the principle of dominance. If they have the dominant allele, they're going to have the dominant trait. So in this case, 4 out of 4 had that dominant allele, so they have a 100% chance of having straight hair and a 0% chance of having curly hair. Okay, guys, please, right now, you need to pause this video. I want you to solve questions number 3 and 4 on your own, and then you will come back here and check your work. So pause the video now. Welcome back, guys. Just because we're short on time, we are going to finish checking. I want to make sure that you get those right answers because you will be taking an exit ticket today. So here are the answers for sample problem number 3. Okay, so there is a 100% chance. So you have to set up your parents' genotypes, fill in your boxes. There's a 100% chance that the offspring would be heterozygous, and a 100% chance that they would have attached earlobes. And last but not least was problem number 4, and here are the answers for that. Okay, so you had two heterozygous parents, and there was a breakdown of 50, 25, 25, and over here 75% chance of no freckles and 25% chance of freckles. Okay. Guys, thank you for coming to my lesson. Don't forget to take the exit ticket on your way out. This is for a grade. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.